welcome everybody. It's an honor to have Jason Mark here with us today. Jason has been at the Energy Foundation for 13 years in various roles. Before that, he was at the Union of Concerned Scientists, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and the Center for Energy and Environmental Studies at Princeton. He is has a graduate degree in mechanical engineering from Princeton, an MA in energy and resources from the University of California at Berkeley. The job that he's in is really interesting in the foundation world. It's one of the, I've said to people before, I think it's the only example I know of in which a large number of wealthy foundations have come together and created a separate foundation with autonomy in doing what it's want to do. 1991 was when three foundations got together and decided that energy was coming down the road and that they should do something about it, and they wanted to do it together. And so instead of making separate grants, they said, we'll make a grant to the Energy Foundation and give money to the Energy Foundation and let it spend the money. The Energy Foundation, as we're going to hear more in detail about how the Energy Foundation has developed since 1991. But it certainly is in the leadership position now in the world of energy funding. If I remember correctly what you said, approximately a third of the energy funding from
foundations.
From foundations is now in the United States is distributed by the Energy Foundation, 1/3. And I think the total is 300 million annually. And the model, which he'll tell you more about, originally the Energy Foundation basically made grants to persons working on research in a variety of ways, development, new ways of controlling energy issues. And now it not only does those things, but it does more by way of advising and advocacy rather than direct grants. But and it also has approximately the same number, about 40% of its funders, 40% of its funds come from its own endowment, and 40% or grants from other foundations, and 40% basically are from organizations, foundations that are working in partnership or consultation with them. So it's a really, is that fairly accurate?
Yeah.
Thank you. I call it the hand signal. In any event, you'll hear much more authoritatively from him than you're hearing from me. But I think we all recognize that the issues raised by climate warming and in the environmental despoliation generally are at the center of what we ought to be concerned about. Unfortunately, while there are a lot of people concerned about it, the government is not very concerned about it at this point. I think it's fair to say. That's a major change, and we'll see what happens in the future. But the president of the Hewlett Foundation published an article just within the last few weeks in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, chastising other foundations for not spending more on research and other kinds of efforts to diminish the problems of global warming. And the figures he used, they're his figures. I looked at them, not surprising. They said that no other foundation spent more than 3% of their annual spending on environmental matters. The Hewlett Foundation and the Packard Foundation spends close to more than 30%. So, but he was saying to other foundations, you all should be doing more in this field, because if you don't, we're going to burn up the planet before you all get around to doing it. So, I mean, this is a guy who is smart and doesn't mince words when he takes it. I commend the article to you. It was released by the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and it's in their January monthly magazine. So the guy who's sneaking in right now is Damon Circosta, who is the head of the I started to say Smith Reynolds, the Fletcher Foundation here in Raleigh, and he also is co-teaching my course with me. So he was here already today. He's entitled to be a little bit late.
Academic time.
Okay, so Jason, let me just say, it's a pleasure to have you here. We're all excited about what you're doing, and we look forward to learning more about it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. It's amazing to be here. You look at the list of folks who preceded me in this seminar, and it is an impressive who's who of foundation folks that many of whom I know and adore, and then the upcoming sessions look even better. So if you've got limited time, you may want to consider using it, in a future meeting rather than today. I also want to say thanks to you, Joel, for the work you've done over the years to really study the craft of philanthropy, which very few people think about. It is a really strange and unique little world that I entered 13 years ago, philanthropy, and it bears a lot more scrutiny, a lot more transparency, and a lot more evaluation. So thank you for all the advice that you've offered. I only wish I had started reading your materials more than 15 years ago as you were writing them coming hot off the press. I think I'd probably be in a better shape today. But as the saying goes, when you've met one foundation, you've met one foundation. And so my job today is to talk a little bit about my little foundation and my colleagues. And I want to start with a statistic that puts things in perspective, at least for our little corner of the world, and tell you a little bit about why I think that matters, what we do about it, and then what we're learning, my colleagues and I, about what it means for philanthropy. So here's the statistic. Americans spend more money buying energy in just 2 hours than foundations spend in an entire year trying to change the way that energy is produced and consumed. So in less than 2 hours, Americans are spending more money to buy energy than philanthropy in the foundation world spends in an entire year trying to impact how that energy is used. And that has dramatic implications for how this sector of the philanthropic world has to operate. Obviously, leverage is one of the more critical pieces. So we spend in this country $1 billion a day on buying electricity. We spend another $1 billion a day buying cars. We spend another $1 billion a day buying fuel for those cars. Add in heating and cooling and industrial, and the US energy economy is over $1 trillion a year. And I'm asserting that foundations spend less than 0.03% of that on an annual basis. And so really, between now and dinner time, we'll have spent as much money on energy as a country as philanthropy will spend an entire year. So why does that matter? Well, it matters because climate change, which many people have characterized as an existential threat, is at its core really driven by the way we produce and use energy. In this country, 80 to 85% of US greenhouse gas emissions come from the production and use of energy. And so you can't solve the climate crisis, as people have described it, without fundamentally transforming the American energy economy. And that's the challenge in front of us. And there's lots we could say about climate change and its impacts. I would argue that the scientific community, some of which of course are at this esteemed institution, have done an amazing job of articulating the case for action and sounding the alarm bell, and now it's up to civil society to really respond. Some people argue, and as Joel was mentioning, my colleague Larry Kramer at Hewlett Foundation would suggest that climate change is the most important issue to work on. It's an existential threat. I'm not going to make that case, but what I will argue is that climate change is inextricably linked to almost everything else we care about. And so if you care about healthcare, you've got to care about climate change and the rising costs of healthcare associated with a rising climate. If you care about disaster relief, you certainly have to care about climate change. If you care about poverty and global development, you have to care about climate change. If you care about conservation, let's say it's saving the loggerhead turtle, you've got to care about climate change because the ecosystem that we're trying to protect for the loggerhead turtle is going to change due to climate change. You may be actually saving the wrong part of the country. And so I wouldn't necessarily argue climate change is the most important issue, but it is certainly an existential threat, and it's an issue that pervades everything that we care about in the social sectors. And we're entering, of course, climate change's most critical decade yet. The scientific community is being quite clear in making the case that if we don't dramatically shift the pace of global development to be lower carbon by decade's end, then we're running out of time, and the dramatic implications are impacts of climate change are drastic. And for philanthropy, which is not known for speed, that has really important consequences. So if you just suggest that we have 10 years to dramatically change the course of our energy trajectory, and you spend a year or two or maybe 3, as philanthropy likes to do, evaluating what your strategy is and putting bells and whistles on your PowerPoints and going and convincing your board, then you have just eliminated 10 to 30% of the time you have to address the challenge, right? So it actually requires a sense of urgency for moving forward. And the good news is we are winning, but we're just not winning fast enough. And that's the piece I really want to leave you with on the kind of thinking about why this matters. There is actually, I think, an incredibly good news story to be told about the progress we're making around clean energy in this country, in this region, and actually in this state of North Carolina. There's a dramatic story to be told, and that is, I think, our challenge in part in addressing the challenge is really starting to build out that narrative of progress. So a couple themes. One, the markets are shifting, and markets are shifting dramatically towards clean energy. Last year was a record year for renewable energy investment in this country, so we put more steel in the ground and solar and wind into the market than we ever have in American history. Financial firms like BlackRock are starting to talk about the climate risk of portfolios that they're beginning to invest in. So the financial, Wall Street's starting to think about the implications of climate change. 42 states have more clean energy jobs than they do fossil jobs. 42 states. One of them is North Carolina, which is in the top 10 for clean energy jobs in the country, with over 110,000 jobs focused on wind, solar efficiency, electrification. So it's a booming and growing, it's actually one of the fastest growing parts of the job economy, clean energy. American concern about climate change is on the rise. The latest polling and assessment from Yale, which does wonderful work in looking at the longitudinal surveys around climate on a range of questions, puts climate change as a top tier issue now in the top 10 for primary voters. It's actually number 5 on the aggregate list. There is still an important partisan divide around that, although that is also changing. So for progressive voters, climate change is the single top most important issue that they're going to the poll thinking about, according to this latest assessment. And in the conservative side of the political spectrum, what we're seeing is a growing sense of interest, particularly among young Republicans, and particularly around the free market libertarian aspect of the conservative effort, which is really focused on how do we can deliver sustainable, clean, cheap, and secure energy for the future. So the last thing I'll say about the why we should care about this is, and the opportunity we have, is the policy momentum has been dramatic. In the last year, one of the things Energy Foundation does is support work in 21 states where we do deep tissue coalition building and support, North Carolina being one of them, and my colleague Jennifer has led that work for years. And across those states last year, we saw 112 policy wins in 2019, most we've ever seen before. What's exciting about those wins is half of them came outside of the power sector. If we're serious about solving the climate challenge, we absolutely need to get to zero carbon electricity, but we also have to electrify everything else possible with clean electricity, our cars, our homes, our businesses, industry. And so we're starting to see progress, not just in the power sector, which has been the success story in clean energy in this country, but also in other important sectors that are going to solve the problem a decade from now. The second really critical aspect of those policy wins is half of those 112 wins happened in states that Trump won in 2016. So whether you call those states red or purple or in transition, we're starting to see policy progress, not just in the progressive coasts, but also in the heartland and across America. And so I see actually huge level of momentum, even as I think about the deep sense of urgency. So that's point number one, is why we should care and why it matters that philanthropy spends 0.03% of the total size of the US energy economy. So what do we do about it? And there I think the argument is really around strategic philanthropy. It's about thinking carefully about building leverage. So quite honestly, we need returns of 4,000 to 1 on our investment, our philanthropic investment, if we're trying to impact that $1 trillion a year economy. And so how do we do that? So for Energy Foundation, that has meant we need to get very clear about what we call our theory of change. It's that if-then statement that kind of undergirds all of our investments. So if we do this, then we expect this will happen. That is a proposition that you can set up as an experiment. You can go and test it with investment, and then you go and evaluate, building on, I think, some of the great research that Joel and his colleagues have done to really think through how we develop strategic investments. So Energy Foundation's theory of change is the following. Our theory of change is that policy in the clean energy space creates markets for clean energy. Those markets then create public support. The public support then allows us to get more policy, which then allows us to grow markets, which then allows us to build more public support, that allows us to deliver on deeper policy action, and so forth. And so we see Energy Foundation's job as spinning up what I would call a virtuous cycle, in which policy begets markets, markets begets public will begets policy, rinse, repeat. And that's pretty much our basic theory of change. And that's, I think, our job in philanthropy, is to try to spin up that with philanthropic investments. Let me give you an example from North Carolina. So in 2007, a group of intrepid and strong policy advocates helped the state of North Carolina advance its first renewable energy standard, which required renewable energy in electricity, and started to build a market for wind and solar and biomass in the state. So the market starts growing. And 2012 comes along. There's a dramatic political shift in this state. If I remember correctly, it's the first time that conservatives controlled all three branches of government since Reconstruction.
Yes.
So a dramatic shift. All sorts of policies were being reviewed, from healthcare to social policies to civil rights policies and clean energy policies. So this renewable energy policy that was written back in 2007 is now in the crosshairs of conservatives who are concerned about clean energy requirements as part of the policy. That policy never got overturned, and here's why. There are a set of public supporters, whether from big corporations like Google and Apple and Facebook, who had server farms in North Carolina or wanted to build them, and they wanted clean energy to do that because that's what their customers demanded and that's what they've promised to their customers. You wipe away this renewable policy, and all of a sudden the market for the clean energy that they want to buy to feed their server farms goes away. We had a growing clean energy industry, solar and renewable and wind developers who are starting to create jobs in the state of North Carolina, who are active voices and saying, no, this policy created our industry and we want this industry to grow. This is actually jobs in your district, Senator X, when you develop the right public policy. So we had built this public support. We had the pork producers and the Farm Bureau on side to advance clean energy because they're part of the renewable energy policy market. And so you had this incredibly diverse set of supporters. It wasn't just, as much as I love my dear friends at Sierra Club, it wasn't just Sierra Club activists. It's a really diverse array of coalition support for clean energy that held a policy in place that allowed the market to continue to grow. And so then we get to 2017, when the North Carolina passes the Energy Reform Act that further expands these markets, right? So 2007 policy builds these markets for clean energy, creates this public support, everything from the pork producers to Apple, allows us then to build the next round of policy in 2017 that's going to then build the next round of markets. That's our theory of change, and that's our theory of change in action. A couple things about it, and I want to suggest that we're learning around this theory of change as we build it out. One is that it requires some of the new approaches. It requires a very big tent to be successful. I am a fierce independent, and I love the idea of a sensible center, maybe 1970s style, thoughtful, reasoned debate, where people get around in a room like this and sit down and bring their facts to the discussion and sort it out and find a path forward. And there is a way to do that when it comes to clean energy and climate change. I just don't think that's the world we live in today. I think that the sensible center, unfortunately, has been hollowed out in America. And what that means for our work at Energy Foundation is we need to build a very big tent to succeed. So no, I think gone are the days of philanthropy funding a study and getting the smartest people together in a room and handing it off to the government policymakers, and they say, oh, thank you for solving our problem. We're now done with climate change. Those days are over, and so what it requires is really building a much broader movement and broader set of support. So for us, that has meant really deepening our investments outside of the center and focusing on both the left and the right. And I want to be really explicit in making the case for why to focus in on the right when it comes to advancing clean energy and ultimately climate action. We don't get to yes on solving this dramatic challenge in most state policy venues, and certainly at the federal level, if we don't have bipartisan support. And I firmly believe that that is our path forward. There is a very strong and credible case to be made on the for clean energy in conservative circles, and we're starting to see dramatic interest and growing interest as the political economy of this issue shifts to bring in more voices to the debate. So when all of a sudden your state has more clean energy jobs than fossil energy jobs, then folks who are very much focused on building economic wealth and prosperity are starting to think about a different type of economy. And that's the sort of shift that we have found can bring, we've now a couple dozen states who have conservative energy networks that are building out a conservative case for why we should care about clean energy. At the same time, we also need to move closer to community-based organizations and equity and justice institutions who are starting to think about how do we build a clean energy future for all? How does everybody have a seat at the table? How do we build that out? And so our challenge becomes, as an institution, how do we invest in such a dramatically diverse, big tent of action? And I'll say more about what we're learning in that process in a minute. But absolutely critical to our theory of change and being successful in our mind is the idea that we have to have a very big tent. The second approach that I want to highlight, and one of the things we're learning in our theory of change, is around innovation. So as I said, we are making progress in solving the climate challenge. We're building markets for clean energy, but it's not fast enough. And in fact, it's not fast enough literally by a factor of 2. We need to double the pace of clean energy development in this country if we're serious about staving off the most serious impacts of climate change. So we're going to be able to do that by spinning up this wonderful theory of change and continuing to advance the policies that drive the markets, that build public support to drive more policy. And we need to take more risk. We need to innovate. And so one of the challenges for us as an institution, we make 700 grants a year. And so we have a lot of grantees coming back and saying, I'm ready for the next investment. Here's what I'm going to do next year. And they're amazing ideas. But what do we do to create space for the crazy ideas that we want to go test and experiment with? And so one of the tools that we've started to use inside the foundation and are talking with some of our funder colleagues to do more of, we've actually created an innovation fund inside the organization. So we've said we're setting aside money on an annual basis that is for the ideas that are not in your basic plan and not in your core to your theory of change strategy. We want you to go experiment. This is money you wouldn't otherwise get, so don't worry about robbing Peter to pay Paul, but rather here's a fund that is dedicated to the proposition that we need to take more risk and we need to go test out new ideas. So the first year that we ran the innovation fund, I think we might have had $2 million. And $2 million for the type of investments that we're making and experimenting might have been 5 to 10 grants that we want to make. We got 45 ideas just from our internal staff, which was fantastic. Obviously, what, new money? Absolutely, I'll make the case for some new idea. And here's my, here are 12 of them. So we were able to fund, I think we ended up funding actually 6 projects after all, in part because Jennifer's idea was so good, we gave it a third of the money. But, and it's important to be able to fund things, at the scale that they're required to really experiment. And so as a result, there were a couple dozen projects that were left on the cutting room floor. What we discovered is that some of those projects just found their way magically into the base budgets of the programs. It was such a good idea. I sold myself that it was such a great idea. I'm just going to go find a little bit of money in the seat cushions of my budget to invest in that. And so we drove innovation, not just with those 6 projects that we funded, but also across the whole institution. So that's an example, I think, of the type of work that we need to be doing across philanthropy and certainly in the clean energy space if we're going to meet this awesome challenge, is to drive more innovation. So those are 2 of the kind of new approaches, I think, that as we think about our theory of change that we've been trying to implement. How do we build a bigger tent, and how do we drive more innovation? So a few more things about what we're learning, and I want to reflect in particular about what we're learning as a philanthropy per se, and I'd summarize that by describing it sort of integrated thinking and powerful networks. That's the work that we have in front of us. So as Joel said, the Energy Foundation was launched in 1991. 3 foundations came together: Pew Charitable Trust, MacArthur Foundation, and Rockefeller Foundation, and said, instead of building out our own energy programs, why don't we work together? Which was a bit of a radical idea back in 1991 for big foundations. It might still be a radical idea
Still
today.
a radical idea.
Exactly. And so, and not only did they say, let's go build it somewhere else and do a joint program, they actually gave it a 10-year runway. So it was a big bet. It was $100 million over 10 years that those 3 foundations put up, which in 1991 was a big bet, to create the Energy Foundation. So that was the beginning of it, and we still look back to those roots of collaboration and pooled funding and pooled strategy to really guide our work going forward. But what we've discovered is that over the years we've needed to adjust our institution to really, as we've clarified that theory of change. So in 1991, it was run and really peopled by policy wonks. Folks like me. I love policy wonks. We're wonderful folks, reasoned, thoughtful, fact-based, strategic, of course, at our best. And we brought a brand of techno-optimism that's absolutely essential in the clean energy space. There is no way you could be working in this space without, I think, optimism about where the technology can take us. But what we learned, of course, over the span of 28 years was that is absolutely not enough, right? And so we started with largely policy wonks, and then we discovered, you know what, if we're serious about our theory of change and it's about building public will, maybe we need some people who can think a little bit about campaigns. And so then we started hiring campaign folks. So we had policy wonks now and political hacks to help us think through our strategy. And that was a great start. And in our next evolution, we called that Energy Foundation 2.0, as we brought in more diverse voices. And then what we discovered is that's fantastic. We're doing a great job of coming up with this wonderful policy ideas in partnership with this amazing network of organizations. We're starting to get smarter about how to engage folks politically and from a campaign perspective. And we still weren't winning at the pace we wanted to. And where we arrived at, the thought we arrived at was this is really ultimately about culture change. That if we're serious about solving this challenge at the pace we need to, it's great to have amazing technology. It's great to have everybody from the Sierra Club to the Justice Center to Conservative Energy Network on board. But really, we need to get the broader public, and we need communications. And so we have now added to our stable of policy wonks and political hacks, communication expertise, and spin doctors, some might call them, to add to the mix. And so now we actually have a program team that's composed of policy, campaign, and communications expertise, all working together to develop an integrated strategy that brings all of those areas of expertise to the table. And the jury is out on how successful this new approach, which is a couple years old, will survive. But so far, we have seen the pace of progress dramatically tick up across the networks, and we feel like we're having a much broader sense of a more thoughtful, fulsome strategy. So that's point number one, is that our organization has had to evolve as our theory of change has had to evolve. Point number two is back to our beginnings. We have this amazing opportunity at the Energy Foundation to align other funders in the field of funders in this space. So as Joel said, roughly 1 out of 3 foundation dollars in the US focused on climate clean energy comes through the Energy Foundation, and we spend a lot of time coordinating with that other 2/3 of the investment because at the end of the day, when you can get funders to all agree on a path forward or a set of paths forwards, then all of a sudden you can get a lot more done in an aligned fashion. And so that has meant we're relying on other foundations for their deep expertise, other foundations for their deep relationships, and bringing ours to the table as well. It allows those funders to rely on us as a regranting agency. So imagine a foundation that might give away $30 million in the United States on climate clean energy, but their board only allows them to have 2 or 3 staff. There's no possible way to invest that level of money into a very complex problem with 2 or 3 people. And so the Energy Foundation plays a critical role as a strategic grant maker. As I said, I think earlier, we make 750 grants a year. And we have a pretty sizable program staff to be able to do that. What we've learned over the years is that having those program staff close to the field and working in partnership with other funders and with grantees is absolutely critical. So we now have 4 regional efforts, including an office in Raleigh, that thinks about the Southeast from a holistic perspective, but from on the ground rather than from San Francisco. Obviously, we're getting much better information and better advice around our grant making when we do that. The second key piece of what Energy Foundation has learned over the years and has been building up is around what we call campaign and strategy services. So as a philanthropy who invested in so much of the energy field and so many of the grantees that other funders are investing in, we see opportunities for building really powerful coalitions. If you need a really big tent, you also need somewhat of a ringmaster to help pull that tent together. Our job is not the ringmaster, we're the investor. But we support the folks who help build these coalitions and help them coordinate, giving them unbranded capacity around communications or unbranded capacity around government relations, or pulling them together to come up with a single strategy. So instead of working in the state of North Carolina on 12 different policy ideas in the clean energy space, maybe it's 3 this year, and then it's another 3 next year, and then it's another 3 the following year, so that we're getting a stronger coordination of the field. The other thing I would say about the role that we play is because we're both a grant seeker, right? We don't have an endowment, and so we're working with other people's funding and aggregating it to make investments. And we actually have 40 donors across the Energy Foundation. So we understand a little bit what it's like to be a grant seeker. And so when we turn around and are actually being grant makers, I think it gives us a bit of humility around what it takes and what it's like to be a grant seeker. An example of one of the experiments we ran and then made it a formal policy is we no longer require narrative reports from our grantees. So I'll just tell you a little bit more about how we got there. That is an uncommon experience in philanthropy. So you write us a proposal, we give you a grant, we ask for a financial report at the end to make sure you spent the money in the way you said you were, but we don't ask you to write up a final report that tells us, that's typically 10, 20, 30 pages, tells us how absolutely wonderful you are and how everything you did was absolutely perfect and you take credit for everything that ever happened in North Carolina, your one institution, but rather we ask for a conversation. And our program staff are in regular conversation, not just once a year, but sometimes on a weekly basis, certainly on a quarterly basis with most of the grantees in the space so that they're understanding what's coming up for them. And I have to tell you, when I started to investigate this new idea of let's just stop doing these narrative reports, what led me to it was I was the director of the programs at the time, and we had this incredible backlog of narrative reports from that our program officers were supposed to review, sign off on, and write a quick summary. It was they had to write maybe 4 sentences and I would be fine. We were starting to get to the point of we had 200 overdue reports. Sometimes grantees hadn't sent them in on time. Most of the time they're just sitting in someone's inbox. And so I said, well, why is that the case? So first I went down the tough boss approach and said, well, you have to do your reports and you can't, and then we even implemented a policy that said you can't write a new grant until you finished all your old reports. Can you imagine? That doesn't make any sense. But I did get a little bit better response rate on people getting in their reports on time. And then I started to get a little bit more curious and said, well, so why aren't you doing them? So I asked a few folks, like, well, I said, well, are people reading these reports that you write up? No, not really. Well, why not? Because we're talking to the grantees anyway. We know what's going on. And the information they give us is typically not quite as transparent as we're shooting for. We really understand what's going well and what's not going well. So started to explore this a little bit. I had one program officer who was quite convinced that, I won't even use a pronoun just to make sure we don't segregate our team. This person, they couldn't even imagine not collecting reports. How could I possibly know what the grantees are doing if I'm not have these reports to read in my office every day? And I said, well, maybe just talk to them and have a conversation. Well, I'm already doing that. I'm like, okay, well, we're going to do this thing where you don't ask for reports. You're not allowed to unless you've got a really great case. So I actually made the bar for asking for a report really, you actually had to write something extra if you wanted to get a report. So of course, not many people went for that. And then I had an interesting experience with a grantee. So we tested this a bit, and I called up a few grantees, and I said, what would it be like for you if we didn't ask for reports? Most of them said, oh my gosh, you'd save us so much time. What would I mean, this is fantastic. We'll get more work done. It's better investment for you. Everybody wins. One grantee, a large national organization, said, well, hold on a second. If I don't have to write you a report, then how am I going to keep my own staff accountable for delivering on the work that we promised? And I said, well, here's what you do. Have them write the report, just don't send it to us. If that's what you need to manage your team, to ensure that you're holding them accountable, go for it. We just don't want the report. So we've been reportless, I think, for 3 or 4 years now. Took a bit of conversation with our board. How are you going to measure? How are you going to know? And even the program officer said, I can't live without reports. Is so happy not to have to do the reports. We're moving faster. Grantees are spending, I'd say, wasting less time writing us tomes of self-promoting material. We're actually having more honest conversations with our grantees about what is going well and what's not going well. And the thing that I put in place in return for giving away individual reports is I ask them to evaluate a portfolio, the whole portfolio. So for example, on an annual basis, I'll say, okay, tell me about the whole portfolio of grantees in North Carolina. What's going well, what's not going well?
Officer or the grantee?
The program officers.
Okay.
All right, so I'm asking the program officer to say, I'm invested in 15, 20 organizations in a state. I'm going to write up a paragraph on here's what's going well with that coalition, here's what needs some work, gosh, we need more labor, or boy, we're really weak, our consumer voice is weak, or gosh, I wish I had more business. And that becomes a template then for their next year's investment portfolio. But it is looking at, I would argue, the forest rather than the individual trees of each individual grant, because no single organization can possibly get everything that's needed to get that is needed to be successful under any campaign strategy. So we've been learning about how to work better with the amazing organizations across the country who with deep expertise in advocacy and research, in communications and campaigns, by building out this unbranded support to help work with them in coalition, by trying to lighten their load just from a process perspective and engaging them. And then the third kind of critical piece to our business model is something I already mentioned, which is really raising money for the field. So not for Energy Foundation, but for the issue area. Our job, my job as the CEO, is primarily to be out on the road trying to build support for investment in climate and clean energy. And when I'm sitting down with donors in this space, it is about making the case that they should invest in this space. We are more than happy to offer advice, free advice, by the way, well, paid for by our core donors, for where they might be able to make a direct investment if that makes the most sense for them, or manage the funds through the Energy Foundation if it's either very specific issue, really complex, require a complex portfolio. And what we found over time is that it's been very helpful to build support for what we call aligned funding and actually track it. So not only do we track income coming to the Energy Foundation, but we ask our program staff and our partnership staff to track the money that they're helping raise for the overall field, as a way to sort of incentivize this notion that we really care about a dollar to the field more than we care about a dollar to Energy Foundation as a regranting institution. So the three pieces that we've evolved to in our business strategy, if you will, is 1, strategic grant making, 2, has been around these campaign and strategy services, and then 3 is around this aligned funding and building funding for the field. So I'm going to wrap up and hopefully leave plenty of time for our conversation. We're trying to tackle a really big, hairy problem. Climate change is among the biggest. There are many other big ones out there, but is the one that, of course, as I argued before, is really built into so many other challenges that we face. And we fundamentally have to refashion America's energy system in order to make it safer and cleaner and more prosperous for all if we're gonna meet our mission. For us, that's required a deep attention to how do you get leverage, and that's led us to really rethinking and refining our theory of change over time. We've refined our organizational model at least 3 times in the decade and a half that I've been at the foundation. But at the end of the day, I couldn't be more excited about the work ahead because we're entering the climate's most critical decade, which means we're entering Energy Foundation's most critical decade.
Well, it's a somber message to leave with us, but also an optimistic one based on what you reported. The good things that are happening are. We've run out of time again. I wish we could stay for longer, but we can't. It's part of our contract with the audience. But I do want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Jason particularly. It's a fascinating discussion, and I'm serious. I think it would be great for you to carry that message to places that could take advantage of it in other fields, because that too could strengthen what happens, redounds to the benefit of what you're doing in energy as well. Welcome again. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you all for coming out and listening, and I hope you'll all carry the message.
Thank you.